I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, who's Zach Holman from GitHub. And Zach's going to talk about kind of his view on open source and GitHub. Zach.
Good morning. The sluggish response I've ever seen. I love it. Loving the energy. I'm going to talk about open source today. I'm going to talk about, well, the first thing you got to do at a talk is figure out what you're going to title the thing. And I'm calling this open source misfeasance because initially I was going to say, let's call it open source malfeasance because that seems edgy and cool. And I looked it up and it said hostile aggressive action taken to injure the client's interests, which seems a little bit too heavy for 9 in the morning. So I figured, let's try another few things, looked up another thing. Misfeasance is apparently to take inappropriate action or give intentionally incorrect advice. I usually give at least inadvertently incorrect advice on all these talks, so that one seemed appropriate for this. So open source misfeasance. The main thing about this, I think open source should be a playground. And I don't think enough people sort of realize that open source is a lot of fun. All too often we think that it's just some kernel extensions or something like that, and I don't think that has to be that way. Open source should be exploration, both about your career, about the job itself, about whatever cool project you're working on, and just in general, have fun with it. I think there's some really interesting things you can do with open source, and it's important to step back and realize this from time to time. So if you're a newbie, if you've never committed to open source before, you should commit to open source by the end of this talk. If you actually do that, that would be impressive, and we should all applause you or something like that. That would be great. But in general, think about how you can start doing open source. If you're a veteran, like a lot of you probably are, if you've done open source stuff before, rediscover open source. Make a distinct thought to say, how can I get back into open source? How can I do more of it? Even for me, I do a lot of open source, but without sitting down and thinking, man, I should really do more today or this afternoon or this weekend. It's easy for me to just get caught up in the day-to-day grind and just not get involved in open source as much as I should. So think about those things if you're new, if you're old, if you're into open source, whatever, and we'll go from there. I am Zach Holman. I work at GitHub, Holman on Twitter, Holman on GitHub. This is my charity dodgeball tournament photo we have at GitHub. I just like to put this up because no one can laugh at you if you have short shorts if you're doing it for charity. So I'm happy about that. Dodgeball is good. And I do work for GitHub. We host code if you guys aren't familiar with GitHub. That's all I've got to say about that. First up, how to fake being an OK programmer. I face this pretty much every day. And I think this question pops in my mind a lot. I'm a horrible programmer, now what? And I think we can all honestly say that because I've seen a lot of code, and I think everybody is a horrible programmer. Code is just not something that people are good at. It doesn't matter which language. All the languages are the worst thing in the world. But where do you go from here? Where do you say, oh, I'm horrible. How do I make myself look really cool? The important thing to remember is I think open source is a really scary jump. Both for people who have never done it before, definitely. It's sort of this propped up thing of, how do I get involved? It's really scary. People are going to jump on me if I do something wrong. And even for people who have been in it a long time, there's always the case where you may push something and then you sort of end up regretting it, or you don't think that's good enough, or it makes you look good. So it's really scary. But like everything else in life, you don't have to be smart to be successful. I mean, this is America. There's plenty of examples of really, really bright people who are super not successful. And then there's plenty of successful people who you're just like, how is this possible? So I actually find a lot of comfort in just understanding this and realizing this all the time. Open source is very much like being an adult. You think it's very magical until you realize that nobody knows what the hell they're doing. They're just sort of walking around thinking, I'm an adult now, or now I have an open source project. And before I got into open source, I always thought that those guys in open source had all the answers. And then you start doing open source, and you're like, wow, no one knows what they're doing. So the question is, how do you fake being smart? And I think the answer is you really don't. But you learn steps to sort of make yourself feel more comfortable working in the public eye in open source. Quick example, I had this project called Spark about a year or so ago. It was written in Bash shell script, and it had a very simple shell script, like 40 lines or so. You pass in a bunch of data, and then it makes a bunch of ASCII Spark lines in your terminal or console or wherever you are. Really kind of cool. The problem is I had no idea what a bash shell is when I was writing it. I mean, I kind of did, but still, anybody who claims to know bash is really silly. So it was really confusing for me. Very quickly, I ended up with like 1,300 watchers or something by the end of the week on GitHub, which was really surprising for me because I had no idea what I was doing. This was a really interesting experience for me because, one, I found that people are really good at fixing your mistakes. And then they'll tell you exactly why you're wrong. And then they'll probably call you names. And then they'll make fun of your language choice. If you do Ruby, they're definitely going to laugh at you. If you don't do Ruby, somebody else is going to laugh at you for something. Start viewing this as an advantage. All too often, people think that, like, oh, man, everyone's making fun of this or nitpicking all these commits and stuff. Yeah, it kind of sucks in a way, but it's also a good advantage to know that people are always looking out for you in a weird sort of hostile fashion. Because it's good. You start learning what you do wrong. The best advice that I've heard is the notion of making mistakes, especially ones that are necessarily embarrassing, those are the ones you don't forget. You think back and say, wow, I'm not going to do that again because I know X, Y, and Z why that's a bad decision. So I really think you end up learning it more and you fake it less. And that's sort of the gradient for everything in open source. It's just you start learning a little bit here and there, and then all of a sudden you have all these projects under your belt, and you don't know how you became this good. And really, you're still just faking it, but no one has to know that. I think the long tail of open source is really fascinating to me. Another example from my past, I have this project called Fatigue. It converts Nike Plus running miles to Garmin. It's just basically another system for tracking running miles. The problem is outdoor activities, I think, frighten nerds, if you want to be stereotypical. So this is not something that ever got a lot of pull on GitHub. Slightly different from Spark. But that's awesome. This is probably one of my favorite projects. It's horrible. I did it in like 2 hours or something. But I still have lots of people to this day say, I checked out Fatigue, I imported my miles, it's really easy, that's awesome. And more importantly, these are not programmers. These are people who are maybe technically inclined to run a command line script, and then they can get involved in all this sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily the most popular project, but it produces a lot of happiness from it. So I think just exploiting your hobbies is a really nice way of sort of exploiting this long tail of open source. So think about stuff. If you're into photography, if you're into music, geocaching, art, if your hobby is forging checks, voter fraud, knitting, whatever the case is, your hobbies are not another Node.js testing framework. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual hobbies. Think about how you can automate that, because we're in a really good position as programmers to take this magic called programming and apply it to real-world situations. And I think that it ends up being a really high impact to effort. You can spend a little bit of time on a project, not even necessarily a good one. Like Fatigue is just screen scraping a bunch of sites. It doesn't even work anymore, actually. I should probably not say that example. But it's a very small thing, and you end up with a whole bunch of impact out of it, just because it targets this area that is not necessarily another testing framework or something. It's something that real people want to use, and you end up getting a lot of impact out of that. I want to talk about two separate areas. One is open source for pleasure, fun, whatever you want to call it, and then I'll talk about business a little bit afterwards. And one topic I really want to talk about is just burnout in general, because I think programming inherently, we face a lot of burnout. After a while, it just gets annoying or tiring to deal with the same old problems over and over again. I say this a lot, and I think it's incredibly true, is code is a creative endeavor. Even though we like to think that it's all ones and zeros and binary constructs and all this stuff, inherently it's just problem solving. You're figuring out the best way or the fastest way or the most creative way or the least lines of code, and that involves a lot of creativity, ironically enough, to do really good code. And I find open source is a really good breather for that, because just a whole bunch of different ways. It's not necessarily tied to a specific problem that you have to face in your real world, unless you're doing it for your job. But it's just really good for a lot of these things. Learning is just a really good aspect of this. Forcing yourself to try new techniques is great. The number of times at GitHub where somebody has gone off and started studying some new technique of something, and they're not necessarily doing work-related stuff, But a couple weeks later, they come back and use that in a production deployment because they've gone into sandbox mode and been able to test out totally different new techniques that they wouldn't have otherwise. Forcing yourself to try new languages is also really fascinating for open source. Spark is a good example of this because, again, like I didn't really know shell as well as I could. And by forcing myself, I mean, I could have written that in Ruby in 2 lines type of deal. But since it was in shell, you end up learning a whole bunch of stuff. And again, people will tell you your mistakes if you do something wrong. I love this idea. I've heard people say, every time they learn a new language, they apply it to a specific domain. Like the classic example is a to-do app. And they just re-implement that same app every time they learn a new language. I love that idea of just like using some of the same app and then just re-implementing it every time. That's really awesome. And remember, you're not getting paid, so you can't get fired. No one's ever been fired from open source. Probably. I don't know. Has anybody ever been fired from open source? That'd be interesting. But usually you're not. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter if you screw up. And yeah, you know, people may damage your ego or something, but this is the place where you can really try interesting things. Fame and glory is also an aspect of open source, and it makes people uncomfortable. If you want to be stereotypical about nerds, they tend to be a little bit more introverted and stuff, which is awesome. That's a great quality, but I don't think that it's necessarily something we should shy away from. It's good to have a reputation. The reality is your clout score really does matter. I'm totally just kidding. Your clout score does not really matter. But the reality is that publicity helps. And I think this is something that not enough people necessarily realize. The reason for that is I think you don't know what you'll launch tomorrow. And I don't care what you launch, if that's a new career, if that's a new startup, a new company. Even though you may not need the publicity around the new company that you may start 3 years from now, if you start building a following around your open source, around your projects, around your blog posts, that all is something that you can leverage down the line. So, work on stuff for the right reasons today. Like, you want to have fun, you want to learn new techniques, you want to share your expertise with the rest of the community. But also realize, like, this stuff does matter down the line. Like, the number of connections you'll make just from like meeting people in open source, working on the same projects together, that ends up being valuable. I want to talk about business a little bit, because that's why you're all here, I guess. Your bosses sent you to talk about business. So like the Fortune 100 does open source or something like that. I'm not really interested in the open source 100, so I want to talk about real businesses. That was a dig at the open, I'm just kidding. We love those big businesses. One thing I really love about GitHub itself, repositories lend themselves to be used in a lot of interesting fashions. 37 Signals puts their entire API on GitHub. So they have all of their example code. They have everything is versioned, so all of their markdown documents, you can see very clearly, like, oh, on March 13th, they changed this to have a different endpoint. And it's all very diffable, so you can very explicitly see, oh, yeah, this returns an array rather than just a string at the end of this. I thought that's a really cool idea, and they just put all of this on here. You can comment on it. You can go through a whole bunch of different stuff, and that's really cool to see them just versioning everything. I mean, GitHub doesn't even version our own stuff on GitHub, so this is really interesting. As far as GitHub's concerned, we have something called GitHub services. These are all your service hooks that stem from when you push code to GitHub. We support like 110 plus services, and to give you a hint, like there's no way we could have done this ourselves. Like you would have had to have all of us at GitHub spin up 110 services, make sure all the integration points work. Like that's just silly. So this way we're able to leverage a whole bunch of different contributors to our project, and we get a whole bunch of benefit for the whole community out of this. Like a very simple thing, but I find this really fascinating to see how you can use open source in a sort of more real-world, down-to-earth fashion. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about just kind of trickery. Not trickery. Trickery seems evil. Interesting parts of open source. If you guys have used GitHub before, you'll probably see something like this. Holman merged, so-and-so pull request. For me, who's done this a bunch, I get a lot of contributions to some of my projects. This is not that big of a deal for me. I merge stuff all the time, yada, yada, yada. If this is your first pull request that you've ever sent in your life, that looks slightly different. It looks more like this. Because you're so excited, right? You're like, my code has been merged in. I am now in open source. And it's important. And I think your first pull request is sacred. Specifically for maintainers, just don't ruin someone's first time. Sit back and realize that somebody is putting themselves out there. In this specific example, one commit with one addition, one deletion. I think this was just a documentation change. And again, for me, running a project, not a big deal. But for the person doing this, I mean, you have to sit back and recognize that open source is really scary. To get to that point, to make that one character change, you have to figure out what repositories are, cloning them down, sending, pushing it back upstream, sending a pull request or a patch or something like that. There's a lot of steps involved with just doing a simple change like that. And I think that's sort of the problem with open source projects sometimes, where people get really disillusioned and just say, that's not up to spec. I'm not going to merge this or something like that. And it's bad. Being helpful leads to a lot more contributions in the future. There's a lot of projects where as soon as you make a contribution, they'll just give you commit rights for the repo, which I think is a fascinating example of giving people the responsibility to contribute where they can. And I think that there's been a lot of cases where I've seen where somebody commits like a really dumb change, really small thing. And that's sort of the first step. Like once you create a supportive atmosphere, they start coming back more and more and more and more. So just recognize that this stuff really matters. All the little changes are really important. Rhetoric question. Do you know what the best GitHub event is? The newsfeed events. This one. So-and-so open sourced a particular repo. This doesn't happen too much, but I love it. Basically what this is saying, you go from a private repository to a public repository. And in other words, you say you go from a finished, polished project to a publicized project. I say this because repos with a README are sad. Sometimes, I'll search on GitHub and you're looking for just the right answer for something that you really want. And the repository, the project, you're just like, yeah, that's what I want. And then you go there and it's just like a README of like, oh yeah, this is going to be great once I actually do the code. That's sad. I really like the reveal. I like the idea of someone hacking privately for like a week or something like that and then coming up with a really polished project. It's exciting. It's delightful. I think it really encourages sharing. If you want to get towards the publicity aspect again, it encourages tweeting. It encourages Facebook like +1 Gshare, Friendship Toolchain, and EJ. I lost the end of it. I'm sorry. I practiced that for a little bit. But it encourages people to share stuff, and I think that's really interesting. So think about, can you go from sort of a smaller project and then sort of announce it like you would a proper project or a proper product itself from a company? Docs-first development, I think, is also really critical in open source because it really increases your code quality. I'm just kidding. I don't care about code quality whatsoever. What I'm saying here is I think documentation in your READMEs, bootstrap scripts, issues, it just means less work for you. The number of times where I've ended up pushing up issues to a personal project of mine and saying, well, I know I have to do this, I know I have to do this, I know I have to do this, and then because I knew I was going to get to it in the next few weeks, and then somebody randomly on the internet says, well, you've already defined the problem, I can now sweep in and fix that for you. That's awesome. It means less work for me. And that's the key to all of life, is just producing less work for you. Help people help you. Traditionally, I tend to do bootstrap scripts at the very end of the project, right? Because you're excited about the problem domain, and you're like, I just want to figure out the really cool parts of the code. And then at the very end, right before you consider it 1.0, you say, all right, run this script to actually install everything. To set up your dependencies and stuff. And I think that's bad. You should set that up first because that lets people jump into it much faster and help you out much faster. And again, reduce your workload. As I mentioned or alluded to earlier, I really love pointless code, stuff that really doesn't matter. I swear I'm going to push code like this at some point, and I apologize, this is going to be Ruby. You can follow along. Basically a method or function called encrypt. You send in a password, and then I'm just going to do 50 lines of ridiculous string mutation code, for security and stuff like that. And at the end, I'm just going to return the unadulterated password. Because this makes me laugh, I think it's really important to play. And in this case, I mean, anytime you can troll security people about like, this is a secure hashing algorithm, it drives them crazy, which is hilarious. But I like to think like if I put something like that in a project, something that may not actually impact the performance of the library or something, but something that is kind of an inside joke, somebody's going to get a kick out of that. And I think that's interesting to think about, well, what can you do in your projects that will make people laugh or make people excited to work on it, or just say, oh, that brightened up my day a little bit. A good example of this that I saw recently is something called GIF sockets. It's real-time communication using GIFs. this is kind of funny because it pushes text to the client frame by frame. It turns out GIFs you can just render infinitely from the server, and then the server will just push frame by frame by frame. So somebody ended up saying, well, if I could just render text on an image and then push that as a frame to a GIF, you can use that as a communications medium and then send JavaScript through it and then push it to the client, and you can see, oh, that's changed. Absolutely, it's like a problem in search, or a solution in search of a problem here. There's no reason why you'd ever use this. But I find it fascinating because the guy or gal who wrote this, they probably learned a whole bunch about the GIF spec just by working on this. And maybe they can, down the line, do something that's actually real. Or maybe not. Maybe this is just something that's really dumb and hilarious and interesting to think about. Again, I love this idea of using limitations to sort of improve yourself, improve your code, improve the community. So stretch your mind. I love the idea of, like, can we use GIFs as communication medium? I think that's really funny. I think that's really interesting. Also, again, I just think it's funny. I think that people are so structured now in our industry sometimes. We're just like, we get to use programming languages to do really silly things. Like, we should do more of that, So just in general, build fun into stuff. It's not necessarily just a career. I think it's a hobby for a lot of us. So think about what projects you can do to build fun into it. I really believe sometimes you have to just build silly things, especially stuff that has no point, because some of the best projects and the best things I've written have been completely pointless, but I've ended up learning a whole lot by exploring those really pointless, silly things. And then just build things. Again, like, it's all too often I get sucked into, well, I got to do work, or I'm excited to do work, or I got to do this other thing. And sometimes it's just good to sit down and say, well, what can I actually build today? Like, sit down and actually set time and say, I'm going to do some open source project today. What can I actually ship today? And I think that's just going to be really good for the industry in general. So that's what I got. Thanks.